It was a typical evening in the quiet suburbs of Virginia, where life moved at a slow pace and excitement was rare. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined streets. Officer Mark Reynolds sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup as he scanned the area. Nights like these were usually uneventful, speeding teenagers, maybe a lost dog or two, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the stillness in the air, or perhaps it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Mark adjusted his hat and took another sip of coffee before tossing the empty cup into the passenger seat. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 8:47 p.m., time to start wrapping up his shift. As he drove down Maplewood Drive, he noticed a silver sedan rolling through a stop sign without so much as slowing down. His instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't reckless driving. This was deliberate. Something about the way the car moved caught his attention. It didn't screech off or weave erratically, but there was an almost calculated smoothness to its movements. Mark frowned. Whoever was behind the wheel knew exactly what they were doing. He flicked on his flashing lights and pulled the vehicle over near the curb. The sedan came to a halt, its tires barely making a sound against the asphalt. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the patrol car, feeling the cool night breeze brush against his face. He approached the driver's side cautiously, shining the beam of light into the window. Behind the wheel sat a woman with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through him. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she wore a dark jacket zipped up to her chin. She looked calm, too calm for someone who had just been pulled over. "Good evening, ma'am," Mark said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "Do you know why I stopped you?" The woman nodded slightly, her hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. "I rolled through the stop sign," she admitted without hesitation. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no hint of frustration or fear. Just acknowledgement. It threw Mark off balance. Most people would have tried to argue their case, claiming they hadn't seen the sign or insisting they'd slowed down. Enough, but not her. She owned up to it instantly as if she didn't care about the consequences. "License and registration, please," Mark requested, leaning closer to get a better look at her. Up close, he noticed something odd about her demeanor. Her gaze kept shifting between the rearview mirror and the side windows as though she were scanning for something, or someone. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was an air of detachment about her, as if she were miles away mentally while physically present. She reached into her glove compartment and handed over the documents without a word. Mark took them and stepped back toward his patrol car, glancing at the name on the license. Alexandra Monroe. Everything appeared to be in order, at least on paper. But something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, poised and alert, like a cat ready to pounce. Or maybe it was the fact that her car was immaculately clean, almost sterile, with no personal belongings visible inside. No fast food wrappers, no loose change, no clutter. People generally left traces of themselves in their vehicles, little glimpses into their lives. But not Alexandra Monroe. Her car was a blank slate. Mark ran her information through the system, waiting for the results to pop up on his screen. While he waited, he kept one eye on her car. Through the rear window, he could see her sitting perfectly still, her posture rigid. Every few seconds, she'd glance at the mirror again, her eyes darting quickly before returning to their neutral position. It was subtle, but it was there. A telltale sign that she was monitoring her surroundings carefully. Mark had seen that kind of behavior before, usually in criminals trying to spot tails or avoid detection, but this woman didn't fit the profile. She wasn't acting nervous or fidgety. If anything, she seemed prepared. When the system finally pinged back with the results, everything checked out. No outstanding warrants, no criminal history, nothing suspicious. Still, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He decided to dig deeper. Walking back to her car, he knocked lightly on the window. When she rolled it down, he asked, "Where are you headed tonight, Miss Monroe?" Her reply was immediate but vague. "Just running some errands," she offered, a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mark pressed further. "What kind of errands?" She shrugged nonchalantly. Groceries. Picking up some things, nothing exciting. Mark studied her face for any signs of deception, but she remained composed. Still, something about her story didn't add up. Why would someone drive through a residential neighborhood late at night for groceries? And why did she seem so guarded? He made a split-second decision. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he instructed, his voice firmer now. For the first time since the stop began, Alexandra hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel for a fraction of a second before she released them. Then, with deliberate slowness, she opened the door and stepped out onto the curb. Mark watched her closely, noting how she positioned herself, angled slightly away from him, one hand hovering near her hip. It was a defensive stance, the kind trained individuals used instinctively when they felt threatened. Mark's pulse quickened. Was she hiding something? Or worse, was she armed? He reminded himself to stay calm. Whatever was going on, he needed to handle it carefully. Little did he know the answers lay just beneath the surface, and they would change everything. As the moments ticked by, tension crackled in the air. Neither of them spoke, but the silence spoke volumes. Mark's mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. What had started as a routine traffic stop was rapidly spiraling into something far more complicated and dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As Mark stood there, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating Alexandra Monroe's face, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong. Her calmness unnerved him. Most people in her position would have been fumbling for words, trying to explain themselves or maybe even apologizing profusely. But not her. She wasn't panicking, arguing, or showing any signs of fear. Instead, she exuded an eerie sense of control, as if she had already anticipated this moment and knew exactly how to handle it. Mark glanced at the documents in his hand again. License, registration, proof of insurance. Everything appeared legitimate. No red flags. Yet his instincts screamed louder than logic. He'd been on the force long enough to trust his gut, and right now, it was telling him to dig deeper. "Ms. Monroe," he began, keeping his tone measured but firm. "You said you were running errands. Do you mind telling me where you're coming from?" Alexandra tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. For a brief second, Mark thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes, but it vanished so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined. I was visiting a friend," she replied smoothly. "We had dinner." Mark nodded slowly, pretending to accept her answer while his brain worked overtime. Dinner with a friend? At this hour? In this neighborhood? Something about her story didn't sit right. The more questions he asked, the vaguer her answers became. It was like she was feeding him just enough information to keep him satisfied, without revealing anything substantial. He decided to change tactics. "Mind if I take a look inside your car?" he asked, gesturing toward the silver sedan behind her. Legally, he needed probable cause to search the vehicle, but he hoped she might agree voluntarily. If she refused, that alone could be enough to raise suspicion further. To his surprise, Alexandra didn't hesitate. "Go ahead," she said, stepping aside and folding her arms across her chest. There was no hesitation, no protest. Just quiet compliance. Again, her reaction puzzled him. Most people would have balked at such a request, especially if they had something to hide. But not her. She seemed almost indifferent. Mark circled the car slowly, shining his flashlight into every corner. The interior was spotless, almost clinical. Not a single piece of trash littered the floor mats. No receipts, no stray wrappers, no personal items whatsoever. Even the trunk, which he checked after asking permission, contained nothing but a spare tire and a basic emergency kit. Whoever Alexandra Monroe was, she clearly valued order and precision. But why go to such lengths? Why make sure her car looked like it belonged in a showroom? His suspicions grew stronger when he noticed something else. The way she moved. Every step she took was deliberate, calculated. When she leaned against the hood of her car while he searched, her posture remained perfectly upright, her weight evenly distributed. She didn't slouch or fidget like most people did during traffic stops. And then there was the subtle bulge under her jacket near her hip, a detail that hadn't escaped his notice earlier. At first, he'd dismissed it as part of her clothing, but now, standing closer, he realized it was something else entirely. Mark straightened up and turned to face her. "Ma'am, is there a reason you're carrying a weapon?" he asked, his voice low but steady. He didn't want to alarm her, or himself, but the question needed to be asked. Civilians weren't prohibited from carrying firearms in certain situations, but given everything else about this stop, the presence of a gun added another layer of complexity. Alexandra's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained otherwise neutral. "It's legal," she said simply. "I have a permit." Mark nodded, though his pulse quickened. Of course, she'd have a permit. It would be foolish not to if she were planning to carry openly. But permits didn't tell the whole story. Who was this woman? What kind of person carried themselves with such confidence yet gave so little away? And why did she seem so prepared for whatever might happen next? The silence between them stretched taut, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional chirp of crickets hidden in the nearby bushes. Mark weighed his options, carefully. Technically, he had no concrete evidence to justify escalating the situation further, but his instincts, the same ones that had kept him safe on countless patrols, were screaming at him to stay vigilant. This wasn't just some random motorist who'd made a careless mistake. There was more to Alexandra Monroe than met the eye. Deciding to push forward, Mark asked, "Can I see your permit, please?" His tone was polite but insistent. He watched closely as she reached into her jacket pocket, her movements slow and deliberate. She pulled out a small card and handed it to him without comment. Mark examined it under the light of his flashlight. Sure enough, it was valid, a concealed carry permit issued by the state. Still, the fact that she carried a firearm, and seemed so comfortable doing so, only deepened the mystery. He handed the permit back to her and stepped back, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Ms. Monroe," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm just trying to ensure everyone's safety here. You understand, right?" She nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "I understand completely, Officer Reynolds." Her use of his last name caught him off guard. He hadn't introduced himself beyond saying officer, so how did she know his full name? Had she read it off his badge? Or was it something else entirely? Mark pushed the thought aside, reminding himself not to jump to conclusions. Paranoia wouldn't help him now. Still, the unease lingered. He glanced around the street, noting the lack of witnesses. Aside from a few curious onlookers peeking out their windows, they were essentially alone. If something went wrong, backup was several minutes away. That realization sent a chill down his spine. Whatever was happening here, he needed to stay one step ahead. Taking a deep breath, Mark decided to press harder. "Is there anything else you'd like to tell me, Ms. Monroe? Anything that might clarify things?" For the first time since the stop began, Alexandra hesitated. Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but then she closed them again. Whatever she was thinking, she chose to keep it to herself. After a beat, she shook her head. "No, officer. I think we've covered everything." Mark studied her face intently, searching for any crack in her composure. But there was none. She was a fortress, impenetrable and unyielding. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain professional. Pushing too hard could escalate the situation unnecessarily, and he wasn't ready to cross that line. Not yet, anyway. Instead, he opted for a different approach. "All right, Ms. Monroe. Thank you for your cooperation. I'll need you to wait here while I verify a few details." He walked back to his patrol car, leaving her standing by her sedan. Once inside, he radioed dispatch, requesting additional checks on her background. He also called for backup, citing a potential safety concern. Better safe than sorry, he reasoned. As he waited for a response, Mark replayed the entire interaction in his mind. Something about Alexandra Monroe didn't add up. Her calm demeanor, her meticulous car, her defensive stance, the firearm, it all pointed to someone who was highly trained and accustomed to high-stakes situations. Was she involved in something illegal? Or was she simply someone who valued preparedness above all else? Whatever the truth was, Mark knew one thing for certain. This traffic stop was far from over, and the answers he sought might be more complicated and dangerous than he'd initially anticipated. The air felt heavier as Mark sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly while he waited for backup to arrive. His radio crackled with updates from dispatch, confirming that Alexandra Monroe's background check was clean. For now. But something still gnawed at him. He glanced up at her through the windshield of his car. She stood by her sedan, arms crossed and posture relaxed, as though she were waiting for a bus rather than being questioned by an armed officer. Her calmness unnerved him more than anything else about this situation. Mark replayed the details in his mind. The gun tucked under her jacket, her vague answers, her almost military-like precision when moving or speaking. It wasn't just odd, it was deliberate. And the fact that she hadn't shown even a flicker of fear made him question whether she was truly who she claimed to be. Was she hiding something? Or worse, was she dangerous? He stepped out of the patrol car again, his boots crunching softly on the gravel shoulder of the road. The flashing lights of his vehicle cast eerie shadows across the pavement, making the scene feel surreal. Mark approached Alexandra cautiously, his hand resting near the holster of his service weapon. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice firm but measured, "I need you to step away from your car." She raised an eyebrow slightly, her expression unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with curiosity. "Just routine procedure," Mark replied, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. Routine procedures didn't involve requesting someone to move away from their vehicle unless there was cause for concern. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in his gut. "Please step over here." Alexandra complied without argument, walking slowly toward him with her hands visible. As she moved, Mark noticed something subtle, a slight shift in her stance, as if she were preparing herself for something. Her body language screamed readiness, not compliance. Every fiber of his being told him to stay alert. Once she was standing a few feet away from her car, Mark took another step closer. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time, why are you carrying a firearm tonight?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time since the stop began, she seemed less composed. Not nervous exactly, but calculating. "I already told you, officer," she said evenly. "It's legal. I have a permit." "That's not what I'm asking," Mark countered, his patience wearing thin. "I'm asking why you're carrying it now, in this neighborhood, at this hour. Most people don't bring guns along when they're running errands." Alexandra stared at him for a moment, her piercing gaze locking onto his. Then, with a small sigh, she said, "Let's just say I value my safety." Mark frowned. That answer was too vague, too rehearsed. He glanced back at her car, then at the empty street behind them. Backup was still minutes away, and until they arrived, he was on his own. He needed to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. Or so he thought. Suddenly his eyes landed on the bulge under her jacket again. This time he couldn't ignore it. Whatever was hidden there could pose a threat, not just to him but potentially to others. His training kicked in, overriding his hesitation. "Ms. Monroe," he said sharply, taking a half step back, "I need you to show me your weapon. Now." Her reaction was immediate but controlled. She froze for a split second, then slowly raised her hands above her head. "All right, officer," she said calmly, "but I want to make sure we do this carefully. My firearm is holstered and I don't want any misunderstandings." Mark nodded tersely, his heart pounding in his chest. "Take it out slowly. Keep your movements deliberate." Alexandra reached beneath her jacket with one hand, her other arm still raised. Mark watched intently, his fingers brushing against his own holster. When she finally pulled the weapon free, it gleamed dully in the dim light of the street lamps. It was sleek, compact, and clearly well-maintained. She held it loosely in her grip, angling it downward as she extended her arm toward him. "See?" she said, her voice steady. "No threats here." Mark hesitated. On the surface, her cooperation should have eased his tension, but instead it only heightened his unease. Why would someone willingly surrender their weapon unless they had nothing to lose, or everything to gain? Something about this entire scenario felt staged, like she was playing a role designed to keep him off balance. Before he could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Backup had arrived. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt behind his, their headlights flooding the area with blinding light. Officers spilled out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, surrounding Alexandra and her car in seconds. The sudden influx of authority transformed the quiet residential street into a tense standoff. "Drop the weapon," one of the officers shouted, his voice echoing through the chaos. Alexandra's jaw tightened, but she obeyed immediately, placing the gun gently on the ground before stepping back with her hands raised. Mark exhaled sharply, realizing how quickly the situation had escalated. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into a full-blown tactical operation, all because of his instincts and suspicions. As the officers secured the perimeter, Mark approached Alexandra cautiously. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around and place your hands on the hood of my car," he instructed, his voice louder now to be heard over the commotion. To his surprise, she complied without resistance. As she leaned forward, her face remained impassive, almost serene. Mark couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Did she see this as some kind of game? Or was she simply biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to reveal whatever secrets she was hiding? While another officer patted her down and retrieved the firearm, Mark stepped aside to assess the scene. His colleagues exchanged wary glances, their expressions mirroring his own confusion. None of them had encountered someone quite like Alexandra Monroe before. She was calm, collected, and eerily cooperative, even in the face of overwhelming force. One of the officers nudged Mark's shoulder. "What's going on here, Reynolds?" he whispered. "Who is this woman?" Mark shook his head, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I wish I knew." Meanwhile, Alexandra remained silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead as the officer's eye processed the scene. Despite the mounting pressure, she showed no signs of cracking. If anything, her composure only deepened the mystery surrounding her. As the minutes ticked by, Mark found himself questioning every decision he'd made since pulling her over. Had he overreacted? Or was his intuition guiding him toward something far bigger than he realized? Either way, one thing was clear. This encounter was far from ordinary, and its resolution would change everything. Backup teams began sweeping her car, searching for anything that might explain her behavior. So far, they'd found nothing incriminating. No drugs, no stolen goods, no evidence of wrongdoing. Yet the longer the search dragged on, the more unsettled everyone became. Something about Alexandra Monroe defied explanation, and until they uncovered the truth, no one could afford to let their guard down. For now, all Mark could do was watch and wait, his mind racing with possibilities. Whatever secrets she was keeping, he was determined to uncover them, even if it meant pushing boundaries he'd never crossed before. The tension on the street was palpable as the officers worked methodically, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating every inch of Alexandra Monroe's car. Backup had transformed the quiet suburban neighborhood into a scene straight out of a crime drama, complete with flashing lights, shouted commands, and an eerie stillness that settled over the area like a heavy fog. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, whispering to each other about what could possibly be happening. Meanwhile, Mark stood by his patrol car, watching everything unfold with a mix of frustration, confusion, and growing unease. Alexandra remained at the center of it all, her hands cuffed behind her back and her expression unreadable. She hadn't resisted or argued when the officers placed her in restraints. In fact, she seemed almost amused. It was subtle, but Mark caught glimpses of it. A slight curve at the corner of her mouth, a glimmer in her eyes that hinted at something deeper. Was she mocking them? Or was this just another layer of her carefully constructed facade? One of the officers approached Mark, shaking his head. Nothing so far, he muttered under his breath. Her car is clean. No weapons besides the one she handed over, no contraband, nothing suspicious. Mark frowned. That doesn't make sense, he replied, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard. Why would someone carry themselves like they're ready for combat if they've got nothing to hide? The officer shrugged, clearly as baffled as Mark. Maybe she's just paranoid. Or maybe we're missing something, Mark interrupted, his tone sharper than intended. He glanced toward Alexandra, who stood silently near the hood of his patrol car. She wasn't fidgeting, sweating, or showing any signs of anxiety. Most people in her position would have been pleading their innocence by now, demanding answers, or at least looking visibly shaken. But not her. She was composed, almost unnervingly so, as though she'd expected this exact sequence of events. Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. Walking over to where Alexandra was standing, he stopped a few feet away, studying her closely. Her posture was relaxed despite the handcuffs, her breathing steady. There was no hint of panic or desperation in her demeanor, only calm resolve. "Monroe," he began, his voice firm but controlled. "I need you to tell me the truth. Who are you, really?" For the first time since the stop began, Alexandra's composure faltered ever so slightly. Her lips parted and her gaze flickered toward him before returning to its neutral state. Then, after a moment of silence, she spoke. "Officer Reynolds, I assure you, I am exactly who I say I am." "That's not good enough," Mark shot back, his patience wearing thin. "You don't act like someone who made a simple traffic violation. You're too calm, too prepared. And let's not forget the gun." Alexandra tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. For a brief second, Mark thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes again. Then, without warning, she said, "If you want answers, check my credentials again, thoroughly this time." Mark blinked, taken aback by her boldness. Credentials? They'd already verified her license and registration, both of which checked out. What else was she referring to? Before he could respond, one of the officers called out, holding up a small black wallet they'd found tucked inside her jacket pocket. "This yours?" the officer asked, waving the wallet in the air. Alexandra nodded once. "Yes, and I suggest you open it carefully." The officer hesitated, glancing at Mark for guidance. Mark gave a curt nod, signaling him to proceed. The officer flipped open the wallet and froze, his eyes widening in shock. Without saying a word, he turned and handed it to Mark, his expression a mixture of disbelief and alarm. Mark took the wallet and stared at its contents, his heart skipping a beat. Inside was an official identification card, issued by the Central Intelligence Agency. Beneath her photo and name were the words Special Operations Division, printed in bold letters. Mark felt the blood drain from his face as the realization hit him like a freight train. Alexandra Monroe wasn't just some random motorist. She was a federal agent. The implications of this discovery sent a wave of dread washing over him. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The meticulous cleanliness of her car, her defensive stance, her calm demeanor, even the firearm. None of it pointed to criminal activity. Instead, it screamed professionalism. This woman wasn't hiding anything illegal. She was doing her job, and he had just detained her during what was likely a sensitive operation. Mark looked up at Alexandra, his stomach churning with guilt and embarrassment. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he demanded, his voice tinged with frustration. "Do you have any idea how much trouble this could cause?" Alexandra raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. "Would you have believed me if I had?" she countered calmly. "Besides, revealing my identity isn't always an option. Sometimes discretion is critical." Her words hung in the air, highlighting the vast gap between local law enforcement and federal operatives. Mark realized now that he'd acted impulsively, letting his instincts override protocol. He should have waited for confirmation before escalating the situation. But hindsight offered little comfort in moments like these. "What's going on here?" Another officer asked, stepping closer. Mark hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Before he could respond, Alexandra spoke up. "I'm a CIA operative," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. "And I'm currently involved in an ongoing investigation, that's all you need to know." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their initial aggression melting into awkward uncertainty. A few murmurs rippled through the group as they processed the revelation. Some looked embarrassed, while others appeared skeptical. After all, it wasn't every day they encountered someone claiming to work for the nation's top intelligence agency. Mark knew they needed verification. Pulling out his radio, he contacted dispatch and requested priority assistance, explaining the situation briefly. Within minutes, higher-ups were alerted, and a call came through confirming Alexandra's status. She was indeed a high-ranking CIA agent, and her presence in the area was part of a classified mission. As the truth sank in, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The officers lowered their weapons, their expressions softening from suspicion to sheepish discomfort. One by one, they backed away, leaving Mark alone with Alexandra. The handcuffs were removed, and she rubbed her wrists absently, her composure unwavering. "I trust this won't happen again," she said, her tone neutral, but carrying an edge of authority. "Interference like this can jeopardize operations and lives." Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his mistake settle heavily on his shoulders. "Ma'am, I apologize. I was just doing my job." "And I understand that," Alexandra replied, her gaze piercing. "But next time remember, not everyone you pull over is who they seem to be. Trust your training, but also trust the system. Confirm before you escalate." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, retrieving her firearm and sliding it back into its holster. The officers watched in stunned silence as she climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Without another word, she drove off into the night, leaving behind a group of men grappling with the aftermath of their misjudgment. Mark stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where her car had been. The encounter had lasted less than an hour, yet it felt like an eternity. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line, one that might cost him dearly. As the flashing lights of the patrol cars dimmed and the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet, Mark knew one thing for certain: nothing about this night would ever be forgotten. The aftermath of Alexandra Monroe's departure left the street eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of crickets hidden in the bushes. The flashing lights of the patrol cars had been turned off, casting the neighborhood back into its usual calm, but the tension among the officers remained thick. Mark stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing as he replayed every moment of the encounter. It wasn't just embarrassment or guilt that weighed on him. It was the realization that his actions could have serious consequences. As the other officers began packing up their equipment and dispersing, one of them approached Mark cautiously. "So, what do we do now?" the younger officer asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He felt drained, both physically and mentally. "We report it," he said finally, his tone heavy with resignation. "Everything that happened tonight goes in the log. No sugarcoating, no excuses." The younger officer nodded slowly, though his expression betrayed a mix of apprehension and sympathy. "You think they'll let this slide?" Mark shook his head. "Not a chance. This isn't just some minor screw-up. We detained a federal operative during an active mission. That kind of mistake doesn't get swept under the rug." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Both men knew the implications were far-reaching. While local law enforcement operated within its own jurisdiction, crossing paths with federal agencies, especially ones as powerful and secretive as the CIA, was a rare and delicate matter. Mistakes like this didn't just reflect poorly on individual officers. They damaged trust between departments and could lead to significant repercussions. Back at the station, the mood was somber. News of the incident spread quickly, fueled by whispers in the break room and hushed conversations in hallways. By the time Mark arrived to file his report, everyone seemed to know something about what had happened, even if the details were murky at best. Some colleagues offered sympathetic nods while others avoided eye contact altogether, unsure how to react. A few even muttered under their breath, criticizing Mark's decision to escalate the situation without waiting for confirmation. Sitting at his desk, Mark stared blankly at the computer screen in front of him. The cursor blinked mockingly, waiting for him to type out his account of the events. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, but no words came. How could he possibly explain what had transpired? Every sentence he considered sounded either defensive or incomplete. Finally, he began typing, forcing himself to recount everything objectively: the traffic violation, the suspicious behavior, the discovery of the firearm, the arrival of backup, and ultimately, the revelation of Alexandra's true identity. He included every detail, no matter how small, knowing that transparency was crucial. As he wrote, he couldn't help but relive each moment. The subtle shift in Alexandra's stance, the bulge under her jacket, the look in her eyes when she revealed her credentials. Each memory only deepened his sense of regret. When he finished, he submitted the report and leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The hardest part was yet to come. Within hours, his superiors would review the document, and then the real scrutiny would begin. By morning, the story had reached upper management. Captain Harris, a gruff but fair man with decades of experience, called Mark into his office for a private meeting. The walls of the captain's office were lined with framed commendations and photos from past cases, reminders of a career built on discipline and integrity. Today, however, the room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken judgment. "Reynolds," Captain Harris began, his voice stern but measured, "you understand the gravity of this situation, don't you?" Mark nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yes, sir, I made a mistake." Harris leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "A mistake is pulling someone over for speeding and giving them a ticket instead of a warning. What you did last night was reckless. You escalated a routine stop into a high-risk confrontation involving multiple units. And worse, you detained a federal agent who was likely on a classified assignment." "I know, sir," Mark replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was following protocol." "Protocol?" Harris repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Protocol dictates that you confirm suspicious activity before taking drastic action. Instead, you acted solely on instinct, disregarding the potential fallout. Do you realize how much damage this could cause to our department's reputation?" Mark swallowed hard, nodding again. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his instincts had always served him well in the past, but he knew better than to argue. Harris was right. He'd let his gut override his training, and now the entire department was paying the price. "What happens now?" Mark asked quietly. "That depends," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "Internal Affairs will conduct a full investigation. They'll review your report, interview witnesses, and determine whether disciplinary action is necessary. Until then, you're on administrative leave." Mark felt his stomach drop. Administrative leave was often code for being suspended pending further review. It was a blow to his pride and his livelihood, but he knew protesting wouldn't change anything. "Understood, sir." Harris studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "Look, Reynolds, I've known you for years. You're a good cop, or at least you were until last night. Don't let this define your career. Learn from it, take responsibility, and prove that you're still capable of doing this job responsibly." "Yes, sir," Mark said, standing up and saluting stiffly before leaving the office. As he walked down the hallway, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues boring into him. Some looked sympathetic, others judgmental, but all conveyed the same message. Things would never be the same. Outside the station, reporters had gathered, drawn by rumors of the unusual confrontation. Cameras flashed as journalists shouted questions about the mysterious woman pulled over by police and the subsequent involvement of federal agents. Mark ignored them, climbing into his car and driving away as quickly as possible. He didn't want to deal with the media circus, not yet anyway. At home, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the wall. The house felt empty, quieter than usual. His wife, Sarah, was at work, and his teenage son, Jake, was staying with friends for the weekend. Normally, Mark cherished these moments of solitude, using them to unwind after long shifts. Tonight, however, the silence pressed down on him, amplifying his thoughts. He replayed Alexandra Monroe's final words in his mind. Trust your training, but also trust the system. She hadn't yelled or berated him for detaining her. In fact, she'd shown remarkable restraint, almost as if she understood the pressures of his job. But that didn't make it easier. If anything, her composure only highlighted his failure to act with the same level of professionalism. For hours, Mark sat there, wrestling with guilt and self-doubt. Had he misjudged the situation entirely? Or had his instincts simply failed him? Either way, the outcome was undeniable. He had crossed a line, and the consequences would follow. As dawn broke outside his window, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Mark resolved to face whatever came next. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could control how he responded. Whether it meant fighting to keep his badge or stepping aside gracefully, he vowed to handle the fallout with dignity. After all, mistakes were inevitable, but learning from them was what separated good officers from great ones.